strong. So here in this passage that we have just read, Paul tells us of a thorn in the flesh which greatly bothered him. It was something for which he prayed to be removed from him. The Lord did not remove it, but gave Paul an answer nonetheless, and an answer that greatly encouraged him. We might not be able, really I shouldn't say we might not be able, we're not able to know exactly what the thorn was. But regardless if we know what the thorn was or not, there are some valuable lessons to be gleaned as we consider, and hopefully we'll get to it this evening, if not the next week or so. We're going to consider why this thorn was given to Paul, and Paul's reaction, his initial reaction to the thorn, and then his reaction to the answer that was given him by the Lord. And so in this study, we'll consider each of these things, but I want to start out with the question, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? And I will state now and probably state at the end, I do not know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. I have some opinions, I have some convictions. I gave you some verses last week to look at, and we'll consider those tonight as we look into what was Paul's thorn in the flesh. There are several possibilities and several things that have been presented through the years, and most of these you can find in differing commentaries or differing religious writers. Possibilities that exist. Tertullian, a commentator, a writer, he refers to a pain in the ear, some ear problems that Paul might have had. Some medieval commentators referred to some possible fleshly lust that were a thorn in Paul's side. McKnight refers to a speech, stammering speech, a lot like we think about Moses. Perhaps we think that might have been, Moses mentions having a speech problem. Ramsey mentions that it was a fever similar to malaria or a malarial fever. And then certainly probably the most common among a physical thorn would be the opinion of some eye problems. And there are numerous writers, Farrer being one. There are others that you can find that talk about these eye problems. And probably of all of the physical things that you could try to hang your hat on, this would probably be the easiest one. He mentions his eyes. in Galatians chapter 4, verses 13 through 15. And again in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 11, there's reference made to his eyes. One of those two passages, and I can't remember, I think it's the first one there in Galatians chapter 5, makes a statement as he's writing to the Galatians. He said, many of you, or you would have been glad to give me your eyes. And so there's where, or give an eye for me, or something along that line. And so there's where some people really draw upon that his thorn in the flesh may have been his eyes. And it may well have been. I'll state again, we don't know. And so we're going to spend some time this evening looking at some things. But in a few minutes, the first few minutes, we're going to be talking about some things that we can't know for sure. But then I want to get to what really matters, and that is, regardless of what Paul's thorn was, what was his reaction to it? And what can we learn, and how would this passage apply to us? But looking perhaps a little differently, as we think about his thorn in the flesh, is perhaps it was the infirmities that Paul suffered, and specifically the persecution that he suffered as an apostle of Christ. This view is like others, is held by some writers. Chrysostom writes, and so by the messenger of Satan, he means those who contended with and fought against him, those that cast him into a prison, those that beat him, that led him astray to death, for they did Satan's business. That's that writer's statement. Peter H. David had a book entitled Hard Sayings of the Bible, and he offers several reasons for this view of persecutions being Paul's thorn in the flesh. And it's interesting, and this really goes into the verses that I gave to you last week. In the Old Testament, adversaries are sometimes referred to as thorns in the flesh, or thorns in your sides. Numbers chapter 33 and verse 15. And I know some of you have looked at these verses. Some of you had looked at them by Sunday and had mentioned it. But there, Numbers chapter 33 and verse 55. But if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall be that those whom you let remain shall be irritants in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land where you dwell. What's the writer talking about? He's talking about those that are contrary to God's people, contrary to the Israelites. And he refers to them and says, they shall be thorns in your sides. Judges chapter 2 and verse 3. Again, therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods, little g, ODS's, shall be a snare to you. So there are two instances in the Old Testament that adversaries, those that were, we could use the word persecutors, those that were against them, were referred to as thorns in the flesh or thorns in the side. What does that mean? Nothing, perhaps. But there is no metaphorical example to go to in Scripture that refers to an illness or a malady as being a thorn in the side. Is that what it is? I don't know. But consider the basic topic of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12, and chapter 13 is Paul's opponents. Those that were his adversaries. Those that persecuted him. And even in the passage that we read in chapter 12, what was it, 7 through 10? In that passage, Paul parallels the thorn with a weakness or infirmity in which he will glory. I would draw the conclusion based upon 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 11, 12, and 13 that he is connecting his infirmities or his weakness with his persecution and what he went through as a apostle, what he went through as a teacher, what he went through as a preacher. Look at or listen to 2 Corinthians chapter 11. And again, this is a passage, I think, if you were given last week. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting at verse 30. And think about the infirmities, his persecutions. And these verses kind of show that is what's being talked about in these chapters. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 30. If I must boast, I will boast in the things which concern my infirmity. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas the king was guarding the city of the Damascens with a garrison, desiring to arrest me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped from his hands. What's he talking about? He's talking about persecution. And what does he call them? Infirmities. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10, that we've already read it, but again it says, therefore I will take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 3 and 4. Since you seek a proof of Christ speaking in me, who is not weak toward you, but mighty in you. For though he was crucified in weakness, yet he lives by the power of God. For we also are weak in him, but we shall live with him by the power of God toward you. So, we could conclude, and certainly we don't have to conclude. I'm not encouraging you to conclude. I mentioned last week I was leaning maybe toward it, but I don't even know that I am, because as we will see, it doesn't matter what his thorn in the flesh was, but perhaps that thorn in the flesh was his opponents who dogged him throughout his missions. They followed him from place to place. They waited on him. They wanted to put him in prison. They wanted to kill him. And so perhaps it's those things that he refers to as his thorn in the flesh. Whatever his thorn was, and again, this is interesting, it was a messenger of Satan. There's something else that makes it kind of difficult for me to hang it on a physical malady, because it refers to it as being a messenger of Satan. That is, it was something from Satan with an evil intent. So, whatever it was, a messenger of Satan, but yet God allowed it to remain. Before I move on to getting into things that really matter, I would ask, do you have any comments in regard to maybe what you read as I gave those passages out last week? Robert.
Seems like you suffered rejection from members of the body that were
Okay.
They didn't seem to recognize him as a full apostle, as a part.
Okay.
That would wear on his ego.
Okay. Robert says that, and it's evident from 2 Corinthians. One thing that I consider as a theme of 2 Corinthians is Paul is defending his apostleship. And he has to do that because some of the Christians, those at Corinth, were questioning him as, and so that too led perhaps to his persecution, those that were against him. Any other comments?
Verse 7 there, it's talking about then a messenger. It seems singular, like there's one thing rather than adversaries throughout his life. I mean, that's just a thought I had.
Okay, Johnny says the word messenger there is singular, and that would indicate that it was a singular thing as opposed to numerous adversaries, throughout time. I think we could explain that away through semantics in English, and this isn't an English class, and I ain't good at English anyway, so we're not going to get into that. Buddy. Buddy brings up an interesting point, and wondering if his thorn in the flesh had to do with him persecuting Christians before he became a Christian. I'm going to add that to my list that I just gave you that supports this view, that it could be God could have been teaching him a lesson. This is what you did to us. You're going to receive it as well, and that may have well been his thorn in the flesh.
If that being the case, he couldn't have too much confidence in what he was preaching and teaching if he didn't believe in forgiveness. If he didn't believe God could forgive him for what he did to Christians.
Okay. Barney brings up forgiveness and the fact that, Paul needed to have confidence in what he was preaching. And so he's kind of saying, well, that may not be the case, that it goes back to his persecution because of forgiveness. And again, I would approach that the same way that I approached Johnny. I think there would be some legitimate arguments for that, like consequences of your sin. Perhaps that would be there. Rick. Okay. Rick's again referring to the messenger of Satan, and maybe again another good way to look at it. Maybe that messenger of Satan was, trying to bring him back to his old life. Is that what you were saying, Rick? Wasn't it? Okay. Any other thoughts, David? Yeah. Yeah. I like your thinking. Maybe he didn't. He knew he was going to suffer, but he didn't really understand what it meant, because maybe he really didn't understand what kind of persecuting he had done, perhaps. Any other thoughts? I don't want to cut you off if you got something. Bob. Okay. Y'all are a smart group, and I like the thoughts that you're pointing out. Bob says perhaps, if you go to those passages in Galatians, it talks about, I write to you in big letters. That's one thing that he says. And then he says something about you would have gladly given an eye or your eyes for me. And Bob makes the point, perhaps his problems with his eyes were a result of the persecutions. And we don't, I don't have it in my notes, and somewhere in Corinthians that read all of Corinthians, it won't hurt you. He lists out the things that, how many times he had been beaten with rods, how many times he had been stoned, how many times he had been left for dead and been in the deep and a day, all of those things that he lists. So certainly, it could have resulted in some physical maladies. Jack.
Well, I just noticed that in verse 9, there he says, I will
Okay? All right? Jack points out in verse 9, Paul makes reference to his weaknesses, which is plural. So we've got some that are looking at the singular words, and then we've got some that are plural words. So it does give us things to think about. Anything else? Okay. Pam mentions that some of the reading that she has done, secular reading, commentaries, not from the Bible, but some readings that she has done, that this writer particularly felt like that the persecution was his thorn. And Paul even mentions it, I think, here, the humble, to keep him humble. And we're going to talk about that as we get in, regardless of what it was. And we're going to leave it with, and I want you to understand that I don't know what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. I'm not trying to sell you on the fact that his thorn in the flesh was his persecutions. I'm not trying to sell you on the fact that his thorn in the flesh was his eyesight. I will sell you on the fact that it does not matter what Paul's thorn in the flesh was. The real lesson comes from why did he have it and what did he do with it? Okay, that's really where that's what we need to hang our hat on. And so let's look at that. Why was the thorn given? Well, in verse 7 that we read, back in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, lest I be exalted above measure. This goes to what Pam just said. Whatever his thorn in the flesh was, God allowed it to remain to help keep Paul humble. Now, Paul had he had a pretty good resume. He had received several revelations and several encounters with deity, or I want to say people of God, spirits of God. We have on the road to Damascus, that's the one we're most familiar with, in Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 6. He had a revelation in Jerusalem, Acts chapter 22, verses 17 through 21. He had a revelation at Troas, Acts chapter 16, verses 8 through 10. In Corinth, Acts chapter 18, verses 9 through 11. Again in Jerusalem, Acts chapter 23 and verse 11. On his way to Rome, Acts chapter 27, verses 22 through 25. And then his encounter with paradise in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 6. Paul had a resume to boast about. And so whatever his thorn was, one reason that he had this thorn in his side, this thorn in the flesh, was lest he be puffed up above measure. or lest he be exalted above measure. Robert.
If you do a little bit of contrast or comparison in Paul's life, before his conversion, after he met Ananias, before that, he was an exalted man. He did have praise. He had prestige. He was exalted above measure. He claims that he tells us himself he was a Hebrew among Hebrews.
Okay? He was before he was a Christian, he was an educated man. And he refers to himself, as he's thinking about his past, as being a Hebrew among Hebrews. So he was. Yet, as a new creature, then humility, the contrast that you mentioned. It would have been easy for Paul to be filled with pride over these revelations and over these encounters that he had. It would have been easy for the church to exalt him more highly than he needed to be exalted. And so that's one reason that he had the thorn, whatever it was. Another reason was to buffet him. Again, verse 7 there in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Some of you read that and you thought you were going to eat at a big meal. You thought it said buffet. But doesn't it says buffet? To buffet him. The word buffet means to strike with the fist. Thus to strive against or to contend. Paul buffeted himself to keep his body under control. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 27. And again, hitting with the fist. That was not a physical thing. But Paul was buffeting his spirit. He was buffeting his zeal and his dedication. And he needed this infirmity to help him do that, to stay in the spiritual shape that he needed to be in to fight the battles that he needed to fight. And I believe, based on what's said, that this was something that was brought upon him by Satan. And it was allowed to keep Paul humble, and that buffeting was part of that as well. There's practical lessons in regard to humility. Humility is a necessary trait for God's people. We can look in Luke chapter 18, verses 13 and 14, and 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. And sometimes we need help to keep us humble. And sometimes we need outside help to keep us humble. Sometimes things happen that we don't have any control over. And it helps to keep us humble. I don't have time to finish this up, so I'm going to stop right there. This is a good stopping place for us. The first bell has rung, and next week, Lord willing, we're going to look at Paul's reaction to the thorn, and then Paul's reaction to the Lord's answer to his prayer for the thorn to be taken away. So we'll spend some time next week, Lord willing, looking at that. Thank you for being here, and thanks for your comments and your participation.
Does anyone know what age Paul was when he was converted? 30? 20? 40?
Maker down there, Grant.
Good evening. Glad that you're here this evening. I heard Autumn. Glad that you're here this evening. If you, I was getting ready to say if you have a songbook. Donald and I were joking about that a second ago. But our first song, Hunter, is going to be song number 643. 643. We had a little bit of PowerPoint issues. So during Bible class, if you saw the blue screens come up and stuff, that was my doing, not anybody else's. Had a little craziness happen today. But Don Copeland's going to lead us in our singing. I have a devotional at the close of the service. Kip Jones is going to lead us in prayer. Grab a bulletin if you can. Take note of all the announcements that are in there. There are several things that I think would be important to read as you go through the bulletin, and just take note of some upcoming events. 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. There is a need if you have some time tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. There's going to be a handicap ramp put up at Pam Thompson's new place. So if you will see Jack Horton, I guess, or Jack Jackson, they're going to try to do that tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So just remember that as well if you have an opportunity to help out in that regard. The more people that are there would really help in that. Also, for those of you who donated blood today, thank you very much. Want your feedback on it. If it worked better to have the bus here or if it works better to have it in our building. They had a slight change due to an illness, so the bus really appeared today, kind of out of nowhere. But we had 10 people give today, and they said to let everybody know that they were thankful for that as well. And you can probably go ahead and mark about the middle of July on a Wednesday. They're going to come back at 8 weeks, right around 8-9 weeks. They're going to be back as well, and you'll be able to give then if you would like. So that's all the announcements that I have. Continue to remember to grab a bulletin. Remember the announcement about putting a ramp up at Pam Thompson's tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning to see Jack Horton or Jack Jackson, and let them know about that. But without anything further, Donald Copeland's going to lead us in our singing.
For the
registration will be 885, number 885.
I don't know how many of you are movie buffs or movie aficionados, and you probably know some quotes to some pretty popular movies. There was a website that gave the top 50 most famous, they said, movie quotes of all time. And here's what they were, at least the first 8 of them. Number 1, they said, was from Star Wars in 1977, where it says, "May the Force be with you." Number 2 is from The Wizard of Oz in 1939, where it's "No place like home." Number 3 was the Titanic in 1997, when he says, "I am king of the world." Number 4, in 1989, there was a movie called Dead Poets Society. And it was "Carpe diem, seize the day, boys, make your lives extraordinary." Number 5 was from 1939, the statement from The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, where he says, "Elementary, my dear Watson." Number 6, they rank from Frankenstein in 1931, where he says, "It's alive, it's alive." Number 7 was from 1994, from Forrest Gump, when it says, "Mama always said life was like a box of chocolates. You'll never know what you're going to get." And number 8 was made famous by a man named Arnold Schwarzenegger. And it's from The Terminator. And it's a statement where he looks at the camera, really looking at somebody else, but he says, "I'll be back." And probably most of us have heard that, and probably there's a few of us that have used that in some sort of scenario where we may have thought it was funny, but nobody else did. But there's an interesting story behind that. When they were going through the script, and if you've ever seen the movie Terminator, it's a very unique movie. It's about a robot, and when they were going through it, Arnold stopped for a minute, and he says, it doesn't sound right, in his Austrian accent. He said, it just doesn't sound right. So he told the writer, he said, "It doesn't sound right. I think that I should say, I will be back." The writer shook his head and said, "No, you're going to say, I'll be back." He said, "But it doesn't sound right." And it was funny. He said, the man looked at him and he said, "Well," he said, "let me be honest. I don't tell you how to act, and you won't tell me how to write." Now, if you know who Arnold is, he's a pretty big fella. And he said, he looked at him and he thought, okay. So he said he got to the point of the scene and he said, "I'll be back." He said he didn't think anything about it. And he said a couple weeks later, the movie came out, or a couple months later, the movie came out. He's walking down the street and somebody stops him because he's very recognizable. And they say, "Say that line from that movie again. Say that line." And he goes, "What movie and what line?" He had no idea. And they said, the one in Terminator, say it. And he goes, "What are you talking about?" And they said, "Say, I'll be back." And he went, "I'll be back." And they said, No. Say it like you said it before." He said he looked at him and he said it in his own unique way that I can't do. He said, "I'll be back." And they went, "Oh!" They said, "Say it again, say it again." He said, walk down the road or he'd be on an airport or he'd be somewhere and somebody'd say, "Hey, say that phrase again." The most notable phrase he's ever had to say in his entire life is, "I'll be back." And it all goes back. And he said this. He said, one of my mistakes was going to that writer and saying, "This doesn't make any sense to me." And the writer said, "Once again, I'm the one writing this, and I know what it'll be. Go ahead and do it." When I heard that today, I had to laugh. Because number 1, somebody told him no. And number 2, if he would have changed it, it just wouldn't have been the same. And he admits that. He says, if I had gone off the script, off of what I was supposed to do, I wouldn't have probably had to say that as much. He goes, but it may not have been as famous a phrase. And when I hear stuff like that, the preacher gears inside of me kick on, and I thought, it's kind of like the Bible. How many times have we heard something in the Bible and we go, well, when sometimes we have to realize that the author of the Bible is God. He's given us everything that he's given us for a purpose, and he knows how it's going to work out. And even though we can read, if you will, if I can use the word script, of how life is going to work out, don't sometimes we deviate off of that path just a tad? because we think that we might know what's better than the original? See, sometimes we might do that. We might think that we know better than the real author. But yet, if we really want to be truly successful, we have to follow the words of the real author. Sometimes we mention this verse in 2 Timothy chapter 3. We've mentioned it a lot on Sunday mornings, but it says, all Scripture is breathed out by God and is profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be competent and equipped for every good work. Because we know that the Bible is inspired of God. But let me read to you another passage. This passage is from Psalm 119, starting off in verse 97 and reading down through verse 99. The psalmist says, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day. Your commandment makes me wiser than my enemies, for it is ever with me. I have more understanding than all of my teachers. Your testimonies are my meditation. I understand more than the aged, for I keep your precepts. I hold my feet from every evil way in order to keep your word. I do not turn aside from your rules or from your words, for you have taught me. How sweet are your words to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through your precepts I get understanding, so therefore I hate every false way." Just think what would have happened if we go off once again, if I can use the term, if we go off the script. If we go away from the words of the original, we're not going to find success with God. Because we know that we have to come to God, and these words are His, and they're for us to obey and to understand. I would ask you this evening, how closely are you following them? Are you following them closely enough that if something were to happen, that you know that you would be okay spiritually? If not, it's an opportunity to change. It's an opportunity to turn our life around this evening. Donald's picked a song of invitation, and we're going to sing this song, and we're going to encourage you, if we can help you out in any way, won't you come forward while together we stand and as we sing.
We read of places of heaven, His name pure and love free. These truths of God's word He has given. How beautiful heaven must be. How beautiful heaven must be. Sweet home of the happy and free. There of rest for the weary. How beautiful heaven must be. Your waters of life there are flowing, and all who drink may be free. Where jewels of splendor are glowing, how beautiful heaven must be. How beautiful heaven must be. Sweet home of the happy and free. There came of rest for the weary. How beautiful heaven must be. Thank you for being here tonight. Remember the services, don't forget the services Sunday at 9:30 and 10:30 and again at 5. Don't forget the sick, don't forget can for them. Is there any other announcements that need to be made? If not, remain standing and we'll sing the first verse of 634. We'll work till Jesus comes. These old songs have a lot of meaning to them, a lot of spiritual meaning to them. We'll sing the first verse on it. Oh, land of rest for thee, I sigh, when will the moment come, when I shall lay my armor by and dwell in peace at home. Will
for the opportunity that we had to come here this evening, to open your word, to dig into it, to study, to learn more, and to hopefully, Father, we take what we learned and we use in our everyday lives. Father, at this time we ask that you be with the ones that are sick, give them their health, be thy will. Be with us as we depart this place. Bring us back at the next point in time.